When Russian President Vladimir Putin started the invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February, many expected a quick victory. 6 months on, things have not gone as planned, and today Ukraine is marking its Independence Day. Coincidentally, it also marks 6 months of the war. A war that was meant to be a blitzkrieg, instead, it is now a slow, grinding assault. The Russian forces are bogged down. They control some territories, but most of the country remains under Kiev's control. Ukrainian forces also are fatigued, but they are hitting back with Western military aid. So just where do things stand after 180 days? When the Russian president declared the start of what he calls a special military operation, he urged the people of Ukraine to turn against Kiev. It was the Kremlin's firm belief that the population would turn swiftly. They would welcome the Russian forces with celebrations. But these hopes were quickly shattered. Fierce Ukrainian resistance and Western weapon systems botched this blitzkrieg. Instead, it turned into a grinding war of attrition. There were numerous attacks on Ukrainian air bases, but even after that, the Russian Air Force failed to win full control. Russia pummeled several major cities, but a month in, Moscow pulled its troops back from Kiev, Kharkiv, Chernihiv and other major cities, a tacit acknowledgement of failure. It was after this failure that Russia shifted battlegrounds. They now focused on Donbas, Ukraine's industrial heartland. There were some ferocious battles that devastated the region. The 3-month siege of Mariupol reduced the city into ruins. Let me pull up this map for you. Currently, Russia has occupied 20% of Ukrainian territory. It controls the entire Luhansk region and has seized just over half of Donetsk. And while Russian troops continue to advance in the east, Ukraine is trying to push back the Russian forces in the south. But Ukrainian forces have recently gained ground here. The two sides also blamed each other for shelling the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, raising fears of a nuclear disaster in the continent. Ukraine also had some successes. One is the rallying support of the West. Western weapons like the US HIMARS have boosted its military capability. It is targeting Russian bridges and key facilities. In April, the sinking of Russia's Moskva missile was a symbolic victory. Another major win was when Russia withdrew from the Snake Island. And the use of drones also has become a key factor in Ukraine's success. Russia suffered a new blow this month when a series of explosions hit an airbase in Crimea. Kiev has stopped short of taking credit for the blasts, but there was no doubt about Ukrainian involvement. However, a war is not just about winning or losing. It's about the humanitarian tragedy that accompanies it. The first question is, what is the human toll? Nobody really knows how many people have died. There are conflicting claims of casualties by the government officials. Some are exaggerated, others are lowballing their figures. But they are all impossible to verify. Estimates suggest at least tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians have lost their lives so far. Nearly 9,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in action. Meanwhile, the US says nearly 70,000 to 80,000 Russian troops have been killed or injured in action. This is a war between Russia and Ukraine, but one that has affected the entire world. The economic fallout of this war has been felt globally, further driving up costs for basic goods. Developing countries are reeling under higher costs of food and fuel, which brings me to the last and final question. What is next? There is no sign right now that Vladimir Putin is looking for an exit. Instead, he is trying to re-engage his forces. So there is no doubt that this will be a long war, one that the NATO thinks can only end on the negotiation table. So the immediate question is, who is better prepared for the long haul? For Ukraine, this depends on the West and their support, both military and economic. The longer the pause lasts, the more weapons Ukraine will receive from its allies. As the war entered its 7th month, the US even pledged its biggest aid package yet, one of $3 billion. As for Russia, Putin is still hoping that the support of the West will fade soon. In fact, he is the only one who can currently decide when this war ends. Joining me on the broadcast first is Ruslan Bortnik from Kiev. He is the director of the Ukrainian Institute of Politics. Thanks very much for being here on the broadcast. Let me first ask you for your assessment of where things stand at the moment. What is the situation on the ground in Ukraine right now?
The main conclusion for nowadays for us is that no one achieved their goals. Russia, Ukraine, Western countries, and no one abandoned their goals for nowadays. Ukraine survived these 6 months. Ukraine broke and Russian plans to seize all the Ukraine. Now Ukrainian president says that this war will go on until the victory and until the liberation of all Ukrainian territory, which includes Crimea, Donetsk and Lugansk. From Russian side, on the other hand, formulates its assessment of the result and prospect of this war in two main phrases. The first phrase, the special operation is going according to the plan, and the second phrase, the special operation will go on until all goals will be achieved. You are absolutely right that we have a war of attrition for nowadays, and Russia is waiting for the winter season in Europe when the prices for oil, for gas, for energy sources will go up very fast, when the economical crisis in Europe will also grow up, and Russia is waiting also the extraction of Ukrainian power and Western help for Ukraine, and Ukraine and Western partners are looking for the inside destabilization of Russia and looking the methods, tools, how to destabilize Russia inside of this country, because there is no chance to change the Kremlin policy to Ukraine by the diplomacy or political way. There is no political negotiation, peaceful negotiation between the sides, but there is a very small chance on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which opens a new level of negotiation, nuclear power negotiation between the sides, and this maybe will lead sides to the political type of negotiation also.
What do you make of the support that's coming from the West? A lot of questions over whether the West could have handled things differently, and a lot more that could have been done.
Yes, you're right, but there are two types of Western help and support of Ukraine. The first, financial. This is the most important, I think, even for this nowadays, because starting from 40 till 70% of state expenditure every month, state expenditures of Ukraine is covering by the Western help. We are not able to cover our expenditures from our taxes. We are absolutely bankrupt country for nowadays because of all. And the second, it's also extremely important type of support is military technical support, which depends of abilities of NATO countries and United States. For example, President of United States Joe Biden today signed a new support for Ukraine for $3 billion United States dollars.
Right.
This support is also with weapons and materials. It's also important. Moreover, Western countries says about the possibility to send troops, Polish troops or Great Britain troops to Ukraine to help Ukraine to defend.
Ruslan Botnik, appreciate your joining us on the broadcast. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Bye.
And with me also on the broadcast this minute is Fred Weir from Moscow. He is a Russian affairs expert. Fred, let me ask you for your assessment of what Russia's strategy is looking like at this point. Would you say that Moscow underestimated the strengths of the Ukrainian resistance?
I think it's fair to say that. There was some complete miscalculation in Moscow at the beginning. They thought perhaps they could deal with Ukraine in one fell swoop by surrounding Kiev. They sent that column, you remember the news stories about the 60-kilometer long column, which was about 40,000 men. Not enough to storm Kiev, but the idea was to just shock the Ukrainian political system and perhaps cause a coup or change of government. It failed completely. It was clearly a miscalculation, and the Russians, by political decision, withdrew and redeployed to the area that matters most to them, and that is the Donbass. Since then, the war has been going on, grinding. It's a war of attrition. It's the casualties on both sides, I think, are astronomical when we get to learn of the damage and the death that's been caused in this past 6 months or 4 or 5 months of intensive fighting there in eastern Ukraine. I think we're all going to be horrified all over again. But it shows no sign of abating. There's absolutely no grounds for negotiation. Both sides are making completely different statements. And the only thing we can say, I follow the war news obsessively on Ukrainian and Russian telegram channels. I can't tear myself away from it. And the most I can figure out is that gradually the Russians are winning. Step by step, village by village, trench by trench, they are moving forward. And all talk of Ukrainian counteroffensives doesn't materialize. But this could go on for a long time.
Right, let's also talk about the West and the way it has contributed and the way it has supported Ukraine. Moscow still hopes that the support from the West will fade. But let's talk about the Western sanctions and the impact that they have really had on Russia.
Well, I live here in Moscow. I have in that sense, a normal Russian life. I go shopping. I fill up my car, drive around, go to restaurants. And I have to say that there is very, very little visible impact of the sanctions in everyday life. I know when I talk to Westerners or go on Western TV programs, they hate to hear me say that because they expect, and everyone would have expected, that the most intense sanctions in history would have a really devastating impact. But at least on the surface, they haven't. I'm sure that Russia is hurting in a lot of ways, and maybe in the long run, these sanctions will begin to show. But if you think they're affecting the average Russian, you're just mistaken. People like me suffer, and the Russian middle class suffer because we can't use our international banking cards. It's much, much harder to travel. There are sanctions mainly on the educated middle class, upper class people who would perhaps be anti-war or anti-Putin, but since they're being rejected by the West and harmed in the West, and oligarchs are having their property seized in the West, they're all coming back to Russia and rallying around the Kremlin.
Right.
So in that sense, the sanctions are actually counterproductive. So I don't know that Western help to Ukraine, which your previous guest was talking about, is really extensive. The military aid to Ukraine so far from Europe and the United States is several times Ukraine's military budget already. And that must be having an impact on the battlefield. Again, in the fog of war, it's so hard to know. There's such a lot of conflicting claims and so much disinformation out there. But experts, at least Russian experts I talked to, say that it probably these new missiles, these HIMARS missiles, are giving Ukraine a far more accurate artillery capacity, but it's not going to change the strategic outcome. It's just prolonging and intensifying the war as it happens.
Fred, good to have you on the broadcast. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.